Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of Elemental Ethnography Encounters with Sensorial Analytics, led by Cymene Howe. Ethnography has traditionally been understood as the study and documentation of ethnos, a group of persons defined in some coherent or not so coherent way by the ethnographer themselves, often predicated upon subjectivities and identifications with place, practices, values, or experiential criteria. In the present, when a global climate crisis and pandemic occupy our attention and eroding ecosystems and mass extinctions condition the future, it is increasingly clear that no, quote, ethnos, unquote, can be thought abstractly outside of enviros. This seminar proposes that by approaching the study of human encounters through the elements, we might better surface the entangled socio-environmental processes that comprise our contemporary worlds. Earth, fire, water, and air represent the classical elements found in Western philosophy. In the Eastern traditions are these with the addition of wood and metal. Through the abstractions and specificities of technoscience came the periodic table, the irreducible material of everything. Within the elemental turn in the human sciences, still nascent in form, we find the interplay between elements multiplied, from chemical relations to the sweep of storm fronts. In this seminar, we explore 4 case studies that follow the elemental qualities of wind, water, and fire as foundational to shaping and sustaining worlds, human and otherwise. We also think through how we can engage sensorial encounters as a conceptual space to grow our analytic possibilities. Participants will be encouraged to bring their own elemental observations to our discussions. And this seminar is taught by Cymene Howe, who is a professor of anthropology at Rice University, specializing in eco-social phenomena and more than human worlds. Her books include Intimate Activism and Ecologies, Wind and Power in the Anthropocene, out on Duke Press, and she's the co-editor of the Johns Hopkins Guide to Critical and Cultural Theory in Anthropocene Unseen, a lexicon. Her current research on cryo-human relations examines the changing dynamics between human populations and bodies of ice in the Arctic region and sea level adaptation in coastal cities around the world. She co-produced the documentary film Not Okay, a little movie about a small glacier at the end of the world, and initiated the installation of the world's first memorial to a glacier fallen to climate change. So with that, I will pass it to Cymene.
Thank you so much, Paige. That was a lovely introduction. I'm going to try and share my screen here just for a minute. I'm really, really happy to see everyone here. I'm super excited to be teaching this class. This is a class that I've wanted to teach now for several years, I have to say. I'm remembering a conversation that I had with a colleague about 6 years ago when I said, we need to develop an elemental anthropology. We need to have a kind of elemental ethnographic approach, a set of methods, a set of theories that we can work with because of what is happening in our collective worlds. And she agreed with me in this really robust way. And then it took some time for it to begin to happen. But now we are beginning to see something that looks something like an elemental turn in the social sciences, in the human sciences. I put it that way in the description of the course, because I do think that it is nascent, but also occurring, where we are seeing humanists who become very interested in the qualities of the elements, in their various forms, whether it's a chemical form or whether it's the more classical elements of Western philosophy. And we also see the social sciences turning in those directions also. And I've been sort of watching this, I don't know, drama unfold and thinking about why it is now that there is an increased interest or maybe a return to interest in the elements as an object of inquiry, as a space of analytic thought, as a way of encountering ethnographic moments, a way of encountering worlds differently. And I think that it has to be tied up into a larger condition that we are now all collectively existing in and through, and that is the Anthropocene. And I'd love to talk in this class about whether we like that designation Anthropocene or not. But for now, just have it as a placeholder, as something that designates this incredible human imprint upon all facets and all spheres of planetary life, whether it's the biosphere, the cryosphere, the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, the lithosphere. We see this imprint everywhere. So some scholars are calling it Anthropocene. There's lots of reasons to debate that. But this kind of tumult that we're seeing in our environmental worlds, and that is affecting more and more people, albeit very differently, depending on where you're positioned in the world, certainly has something to say and something to contribute to anything that we might think of as an elemental ethnography and encounter with that. I think some of the other things that I see coming into play here are really studies that have to do with the more than human. That's the kind of designation that we often use in anthropology. Posthumanism is a way that it's been spoken about in the humanities, including very early on by a colleague of mine here at Rice named Carrie Wolf, who was one of the early innovators in posthumanism. In anthropology, we've kind of taken up those questions about non-human others, about multi-species ethnography, and have come to talk about it as the more than human. So those which are not anthropocentric, that which does not focus specifically on anthropos as the sole point of interest, but that which can combine and collect those experiences and those encounters between gut bacteria and trees and human populations and the domestic creatures that we bring into our homes. And these are just a few small examples of how the more than human turn has had an impact. The elemental ethnographic encounter that we'll be having in this class certainly grows from and learns from that set of discourses and conversations. Another area that's been burgeoning, exploding maybe is a better word, is chemo studies and kind of chemoethnography is what we call it in cultural anthropology. It's a very new field, but it has to do with toxicity and the ways in which chemicals come to impact our lives. And of course, not just human lives, but the lives of non-human others. So the kind of chemo turn, or the sort of a reflexive turn towards chemical accountability and chemical encounters, chemical phenomenological moments, is certainly something that's also being brought into questions about the elemental and how that affects how we live in the world. I also have to give credence to, and a really, really important theoretical credence to, feminist science and technology studies. Science and technology studies in general have been very elemental, very important for thinking through how elements might impact our social scientific work, our humanistic research. But certainly feminist ethnographers and feminist STS scholars like Dinah Haraway, like Stacey Alaimo, like Jane Bennett, these are the people who are really trying to think through some of the really core elemental forms and those relationships. So I've learned a lot from these scholars and these thinkers, and that comes into many of these conversations as well. So I wanted to just kind of set some of the intellectual backdrop for us as we begin. I also want to say that this class is an experiment, and I'm looking forward to experimenting with you all. And I really do want you to embrace that experimental form. The papers and the projects that I imagine you creating in this class, I want them to be wildly fantastical and super, super interesting. So please do embrace that aesthetic, do embrace that encouragement, that note to go forward and do something experimental and maybe even outside of your normal comfort zone. And I'll talk a little bit, I think we'll go through the syllabus just so you have a sense of what we'll be doing. But before we do that, I did want to just say a couple of things about myself and my research. And then I would like to turn to a conversation about what you are interested in and what your areas of research are by way of introductions. So I thought we could spend 20 minutes or so just hearing from folks a few sentences about either why you're taking the class or what interests you in the elements as an analytic object, what interests you in ethnography or sensorial approaches, analytic approaches. Also, some of your disciplinary foundations, what you find exciting, what you're interested in learning more about, what you're interested in researching for your graduate work. I'd love to get a sense of sort of who's in the room, even though we're in this weird kind of digital room together, but I'd love to hear more about what you're interested in, what your priorities are. As you've been hearing, as I've been narrating some of this story, I am a cultural anthropologist. I think it's one of the greatest jobs in the world to be able to go and travel to interesting places and talk to interesting people about things that they care about. In my work over the last decade, I've started to call myself a climate anthropologist. And some people think that's an oxymoron, but I think I'm going to keep on trying to work with it. And that is that I'm focusing on research problems and questions that have to do with the climate crisis, have to do with the Anthropocene. How do we address that? And how can we use anthropology or ethnography as a method in order to untangle the very knotted webs that we find ourselves in? So I spent about a year and a half working in southern Mexico, and I'll be giving you a presentation about that work in the WIND seminar. I've also been working, as Paige mentioned, in the Arctic most recently, and we'll be talking about cryospheres a bit today. I'll share some of that ethnographic work. And now I've launched into work on solarities, and I'm not doing field work on the sun. I can't even imagine how that would happen, but we are thinking through solarities as a kind of an epistemic object and elemental encounter. So that's some of what I've been focusing on over the last several years and hope to continue to do in the future. I've made a commitment, actually, that all of my work, all my writing and research going forward will be pointed toward the climate crisis, Anthropocene, these sorts of environmental entanglements. I think it's a really important area of research. And in some ways, any and all of us who are doing research in the contemporary world in some way are doing research on or within that context. So though we may not identify exactly as climate anthropologists or as cultural critics or philosophers of climate, because we live in this unfolding world, we are in fact operating in that space, whether we like it or not. And so it does become part of the conditions of our scholarship, the conditions of our research. And so it's been interesting for me to see how that unfolds in different people's work, where they see the object of their research not exactly as environment, but environment and questions of climate keep slipping in and keep becoming entangled and sort of messy in some of the work that they're trying to pursue. Messy in a good way, I think, but messy in that sense. So that's a little bit about me. Could we go through and then just do some introductions? I guess the best way to do it would be to, I don't know, maybe just call people's names?
Yeah, I can call people by the order that they're listed in the panelist bar.
Oh, that'd be cool. Thank you, Paige. That's great.
Do you want to stop sharing your screen or?
Oh yeah, sorry.
No worries.
Go that. There we go.
Okay, so Alberto.
Hi. Hello, Cymene. Nice to meet you.
You too.
My name is Alberto Jesus Ponce. I'm a Chilean writer and researcher. I recently graduated of my bachelor's degree in art, technology, and integrated media from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile.
Cool.
And my areas of interest are aging, non-human narratives, everyday aesthetics, and animism.
Great. I think I know some of your colleagues at the Pontifica.
Yes.
In the anthropology and sociology departments. We've actually never met in person. But,
yeah.
We've had Zoom conversations and emails back and forth. And one day I hope to make it to Chile, but I haven't quite yet.
Please.
But it's great to have you in the great to have you in the class.
Thank you.
Alfredo.
Hi, I'm excited to be here. Well, I'm Alfredo from Mexico City. I'm an applied mathematician, and I'm a student of the critical philosophy program here at the New Center. I do art science research, or the kind of artistic research that's into the communication of science and things of that kind. I'm interested in topics like eco-socialism, world building, artificial intelligence, for recognition, and how all of these kind of intertwine in some ways. Yeah, I think that's it.
That's great. Thank you, Alfredo. Yeah, Mexico City is one of my favorite places in the world to go. It's such a dynamic city. And yeah, you have a really nice background with arts and philosophy and applied math. That's exciting. I don't know if I've ever had a mathematician in one of my classes, so that's good.
Anna?
I think it's,
Did you say, oh, you said Anna.
I think it's me, but there's two Annas, but if I can do the first one. Well, I'm trying to, I'm so excited with everything you said. Let me just try to put it all. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I speak from Rio de Janeiro. I have a bachelor degree in painting, but I actually work with, I'm an artist, a multi-artist. I work with a lot of materials. I work with painting, with drawing, with cinema, with many things. And I'm developing a research on how to think pollination as and I think I'm studying that from Donna Haraway's SF, the speculative fabulation and everything that it can be. So I actually got a bachelor degree in painting and a master's in interdisciplinary poetics. And right after I started at New Center, I also got admitted for a master's in philosophy. So I'm now studying what could it mean for us to produce artistically and scientifically in the same basis as Donna Haraway proposes from the SF. And I'm proposing like an poetical pollination among cities here in Rio. So it's something like that. I'm super interested on everything you said, basically.
Great. That's wonderful. And there's actually quite a bit of work, like little pieces of work coming out now on pollination. I think it's a really interesting like sub area of interest that I'm seeing in the social sciences and in the arts. And it's just real, it's really cool. And I think, you know, when we start talking about air and wind, it will be interesting to talk about anachromy, which is the seed dispersal by air, which is, you know, another form of kind of reproduction through these elemental forms. So great, thank you.
Ankur?
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Ankur. I'm from India, Rajasthan. And like, so like most of the time it's really hard for me to articulate, but I did my studies in painting, master's and graduation. And after just my practice shifted towards multiple forms of social practices, so to call, other it's not at all, but most of the time it's a struggle in searching a way or tool to engage with things rather than speaking about things, like most of the researchers and people do, like writing in cabin, earning a lot, rather than engaging in tools of engagement with the things. So like, and for me too, it's really important to learn from this structure and elementality and like how to engage, how to be the one, rather than research about something. So I'm also in struggle of learning about these tools of engagement, be with it rather than seeing it from far away and researching things from far away, a distance, something like, I don't know if it makes sense anyhow, like sometimes I go in and so it's really hard.
It does make sense, Ankur, and I appreciate this idea of engagement quite a lot, because that is something that's really fundamental to doing participant observation and to doing good ethnography, I think when we begin talking about the sensorial aspect, that question of engagement and how do we create those engagements will be really central, right? Like, how do we make a forum? How do we make a space? How do we make an encounter for engagement? How do you produce that? How do you craft that, right? So I think that's a wonderful way of thinking about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Annie?
Hi there. My name is Annie. I'm from Athens, Greece. I just finished my master's in fine art in the Netherlands, and I'm back living into Athens. I make mainly paintings and ceramic sculptures, and I'm kind of like interested in bringing about this kind of like absurd, like illogical worlds of boundary breaking, or you know, my objects kind of or adapt like different relationships with each other that might be yeah, like thinking about other possibilities or other connections, or for example human and non-human or something like that. And I'm interested in how fiction comes into place when talking about this kind of concerns that are happening in the world. And yeah, during my master's and my master's thesis, I started researching a bit about anthropology, and I got really into perspectivism by Viveros de Castro, and kind of branch that is super exciting, and yeah, has a lot of seeds for making. And yeah, that's it.
I love that your cat showed up right when you started talking about the perspectivism of non-human others. She's embodying her inner jaguar, as Eduardo Viveros de Castro would see it. Yeah, he's fantastic. Again, I've never met him in person, but he and I were on a panel together several years ago, and he's just great. His work is super interesting. I've taught it before in anthropology classes, and it's quite controversial, as you may know, but it's very, very interesting and provocative. And so I think that's a great perspective to be bringing to. And I love this absurd and illogical worlds that you're encountering and trying to make. Thanks, Annie. That's great.
Thank you.
Benito?
Hello, everyone. So I'm Benito. I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy at the Università La Sapienza of Rome. I've become increasingly interested in the political aspects of minorities and the political grounds and boundaries that separate minorities from majorities. Yeah, the thing I'm most interested in is the point where ethics, aesthetics, and political philosophy meet. So that's it. That's
great. Good. I think that your philosophical background will be really wonderful to have in the class. And, please bring it in whenever you feel that it'll help us to walk through some of the different dynamics. So, and then this question of minorities versus majorities is always super interesting. So glad to have you here.
I'm glad to hear it. Thank you.
Denise?
Hi, I'm Denise. I'm also from Mexico, from nearby Mexico City, from a smaller city called Pachuca, but I used to study, I studied architecture in Mexico City and lived there for some years. And then I moved to the Netherlands, and I've been living here for almost like 7 years now in Rotterdam. And I think, and since I moved here, I studied like art history, and I started to become more involved with like editorial and curatorial projects. And I think like for the past couple of years, I've been working on issues about like contemporary forms of labor, specifically related to the port of Rotterdam and like fulfillment centers and that kind of thing. And in relation to like critical race theory and like post-colonial theory and queer theory. And now I'm finishing, it's like a postmaster course in the Royal Institute of Art in Sweden, which has been like a really great. And I'm working on like a project related to labor, and hopefully, I think I started producing a bit more like video essays and /video essays /performances and kind of this more of like multimedia work to and I'm interested in the course because I think recently I learned about the notion of ethnography, and I think a lot of my work has been doing that without knowing it because I draw from my own experience with labor and that. So it's I'm excited to learn more about ethnography.
That's great. And the port of Rotterdam is a very interesting place. Another sort of burgeoning field in anthropology and the social sciences is the study of infrastructure. And so places like ports, especially those massive ports like Rotterdam, are just very fascinating objects to begin to look at and try and unravel. So I'm sure you're doing super, super interesting work on that.
Thank you.
Emma?
Hey everybody, I'm Emma. I live in California, like a really small town in between LA and San Francisco. It's kind of a secret. We still actually have a lot of dirt roads.
What's it called?
Los Osos.
Los Osos, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm from Santa Cruz originally, so I figured I'd know it.
Hey, yeah, you did. Yeah, so I'm still in undergrad for architecture. I'm third year, so I'm still very much in like a gather phase. I'm in the post-planetary universal design program within our school, and I'm really interested in like space architecture and a few different things, like all in reference to waste. And like why I signed up for this class was a lot to do with like the elements mentioned. So I'm pretty interested in, I mean, everything about the environment feels like something I kind of can't get away on. I'm really stuck with it, and wondering like how we can work with trash or make less of it or make everything kind of improve that way. I'm in the water a lot, and like watching like the oil slicks and different things happen is pretty interesting, that we can play in something that's kind of a dumpster. And so I find that interesting. And I think in this class, I'll be interested mostly in play. And yeah, I mean, we'll see, but thanks.
That's a grim picture of the ocean. I think it's the ocean as dumpster, right?
Yeah. I mean, I've got tar over my car, permanent everywhere, just, you know, and like the last working nuclear power plant is in this town. So it's like a pretty, like the main beach that the kids go to swim at, like in the summer, is where the sewage plant exits. Like when it rains, you can't go in the ocean for all of California. And this is like a pretty small city compared to LA and San Francisco. So it's just really on my mind.
Yeah, and kind of on your skin, right? And in your hair and in your head.
I mean, you can smell it. You know, you see the reflections of oil on the water. It's amazing.
Yeah, wow. Thank you, Emma. I think it'll be great to have you in here. I think you'll bring a lot to it and learn a lot too. It's especially the waste component could be a really interesting direction to take in the class also. Great.
Luha or Lucia?
Hi, I'm Lucia from, it's okay. I'm from Zagreb, Croatia. I have an MA in art history and comparative literature from the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences in Zagreb. I mean, right now I'm also working there as a teaching assistant, but this is pretty fresh. I only started a couple months ago. Before this, my background is in, as an independent, I'm still working and have worked as an independent curator. In the past, this was mostly with an organization that works with art, science, and technology. So these kinds of living, non-living, human, and non-human relationships are pretty close to me because I was working a lot with research-based, investigative, interdisciplinary artistic practices. I mean, specifically and especially biomedia or bioart. And well, right now, I mean, last year I formed my own, well, with a couple colleagues, Curatorial collective. Here we're focused on experimental process-based artistic practices, and our kind of starting point is a big project, big show that we're doing, which is a regional show for young artists. And our topic or main interest is parasitic artistic practices or methodologies, which kind of challenge and disrupt system structures in a socio-political, ecological, or personal, interpersonal sense. So yeah, this is basically what I'm working on right now. The show opens in a month, so this is mostly what I'm doing.
Wow, congratulations. I know that's a lot to get off the ground, I'm sure. So good for you for having it launching. Great. I think, yeah, this combination of art, history, art, STS, and the process space will be really interesting in this class too. So Lucia is how you pronounce your name. Yeah, cool, great.
Salma?
Hi, everyone. My name is Salma, and first of all, I apologize for the lack of video. I'm quite sick. I actually have corona, so I'm in a bed right now, and this is just how I can follow today's seminar. And hopefully I'm going to be in a better shape for the next session. I'm a curator and a researcher, originally from Bosnia and Herzegovina, but I'm based in Berlin. I graduated in art history and comparative literature at the Faculty of Philosophy, University of Sarajevo, and I also have a background in curatorial practices and media art cultures. I'm co-founder of the New Liquidity Collective, and at the moment we are working on a project called Deterritorialized Listenings, which is ongoing series of immersive binaural sound walks that are reactive to participants' movements and locations, and it has been just selected for a global exhibition program for Projects Anywhere, for art projects at the outermost limits of location specificity, in collaboration with the Center of Visual Art in University of Melbourne and Parsons School of Design and New School in New York.
Great, congratulations. That's great.
Yeah, thank you. And regarding my interest in this seminar, I have to say that a lot of my recent work was also very much connected to element of water, because we were together with my collective, we are trying to combine artistic research with acoustic ecology and immersive technology, where we're trying to examine water's fluid ontology and the forms of life it enables, and position water as this shared human-on-human heritage and a site of geocultural memory. But we would also like to move beyond the perception of water in its oceanic or limnology arrangements only in terms of fluidity, but to see it also as a social space encapsulating complex power relations. So tracing underwater memory and its corporality, and how does the water function as a deep archive, and how can we engage with liquid violence and hydropoetics of displacement, and essentially what can we learn about our corporality from the underwater cosmologies. So I'm
Great.
much looking forward to take part in this seminar.
Great. It all sounds super interesting, Salma. I'm sorry about COVID, but hopefully it'll pass quickly. And
Yeah.
just rest and drink lots of fluids, as they say.
Yeah.
I can do an intro if I got everyone. I think that's everyone who's a panelist. Yeah, so I'm Paige. I'm currently based in LA, and I'm an artist exploring intercommunications between internal landscapes and external landscapes, and that includes explorations of how we interact with our environment through different perspectives of time and language and deep listening, and especially types of rituals that affect relations at an unconscious level.
Great. What kinds of mediums do you work in, Paige?
It varies, but usually installation and painting and sound. And then I do writing, like poetry as well. But yeah, it kind of depends on the project.
Great, great. Thank you. And thank you for your help with this too. I thought that it was super interesting to hear everyone's profile and your interests and what you've been up to and what you hope to do. I think we'll have a fantastic group of conversations here with this group of people. I'm thinking maybe now what we could do is turn to the syllabus really quickly, because as I was listening to you talk, I realized that in some ways I had a very, I don't know, conventional, here I was saying, oh, it's going to be, this class is experimental, and I'm not really being experimental enough in a way, because I have set up as the assignment, the final assignment, a paper, right, which is about as conventional and traditional and non-experimental as it gets. So what I would like to propose is that, can you guys see the screen okay? Yeah. So this was the kind of blurb that Paige read. And I'll just walk through this because we were told that we should kind of overview the syllabus on the first day. But I'm rethinking this final assignment now. So the first element that you want to be thinking about for this class, and this is pretty normative, is just to make sure that you've done the readings and that you're prepared and you have some things to say about them. That said, I suspect that today, because there's other logistical things and introductions that we've been doing, we probably won't get to all the readings. But what I'd like to do is put a pin in the Timothy Morton reading, which is Elementality, and then also the introduction to reactivating elements, this book. You read the short introduction to that. So we can save that for next week. Hopefully it'll still be fresh in your mind. But in general, you know, come prepared to talk about the readings, to have points of view, conversation points that you want to make, questions that you want to pose to the class. Then in the last two sessions, which we have a kind of bifurcated class in a sense, because we have a gap in between, but that gap I think is going to be quite useful. So in the last two sessions of class, we'll be having these presentations that you'll be doing based on the research and work that you will develop during that gap time, I would say most substantively. You could start on it earlier, but I think that gap will be a good time to do that work. And that is the elemental encounter research. So as I was saying, I mean, I had it set up as a 10-page paper. And if you want to write a 10-page paper as your final project, that's totally fine. I'm happy to read it. I'll be excited to read it. And that would be great. But if you wanted to do something different, if you wanted to do something artistic, like a painting or a sculpture or an installation or some sort of multimedia encounter, or you know, kind of a video, some kind of immersive experience, I'm just throwing out ideas because I'm realizing that so many of you in the room are artists. I hate to pass up that opportunity to see what kind of really interesting, innovative artwork you might come up with out of these encounters. So what I'm going to do is I'll leave that up to you. If you'd rather do a piece, if you'd rather do a work, an artwork rather than a paper, I'd be excited to see that. And if you want to do a paper, that's totally fine too. So I'm going to leave that open. And what I'll do is I'll modify the syllabus a little bit later so that that's all included in the official documentation. What I will say is that if you do an artwork or a piece, I would like for you to acknowledge some of the readings, like to have a sort of citational apparatus that goes along with the work. I guess it would be a bibliography. Maybe it's like a short annotated bibliography where you sort of describe very briefly, you know, this element of the work. Now I'm very self-conscious of saying the word element. This part of the work has to do with, you know, X, Y, and Z reading, or the conversation between thus and such philosopher, etc. So if you can bring in the course readings, that would be really helpful, and or the course presentation material. Other than that, I'd like to, in our next session, I'd like to talk more about sensorial analytics and to dig into that more deeply. For now, what I would like to say is that the project itself that will become the artwork or the paper and will definitely become the presentation is an elemental encounter as you see it. And I leave it entirely up to you what you would like that encounter to be and how you would like to structure it. I would like it to be embodied. That is, I would like you to actually be part of that experience. And maybe there are other people or other non-human others who are part of that experience as well. But I would like for you to be present. This is maybe a kind of ethnographic conceit of the participant observation. I think it's important that you be there physically for this particular encounter. But the way you construct it, enact it, who else participates is completely up to you. And I'll leave it up to you to choose any kind of element that you would like to have this encounter with. So Emma, I mean, you said in your intro, like you're in the water a lot. So that's a great beginning space. You could continue to be in the water. And Lucia, maybe you will be in air and figure out ways that you want to have an elemental encounter with air. But then air transmogrifies and becomes something different because of the forces of heat and cold differentials, and sometimes it becomes wind. And in today's presentation, I'd like to share with you some work that I've been doing in Iceland that has to do with ice. So it's an elemental form, but one that is transformed in terms of its phase, its physical state of being. All of that is to say, earth, fire, air, water are the four primary elements that we'll be thinking through in this class. But I'm very happy to have them in moderated and mediated forms, talking about ice, talking about wind, you know, talking about different forms of how these elements get figured differently. You could do a confluence of elements. You could have wind and fire coming together because the two sort of feed off of each other, wind and or air and fire. So I leave it up to you to be playful, to be experimental in that, and to think through how you'd like to do that. Are there questions about the syllabus in that sense? No?
I had like a very stupid practical question, like just for more or less have it in my mind. When you said 10 pages, like if we were to do an essay, what, like in words, more or less, how many were, think, just so I, like 10 pages sounds quite scary.
Well, and if 10 pages feels overwhelming, make it 8. That doesn't matter to me as much, but usually on a page, there's about 250 words if it's double spaced with 1-inch margins. So, you know, about 2,500 words, I'd say.
Yeah.
Altogether. And you know, if that feels like it's too long or too much to try and develop, I'm happy to work that out too. There's nothing magic about the number 10. It's just it's a nice round number, but so is the number 8, right? So
yeah. Oh, just yeah. So more or less to have it an estimate. But thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a good question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So for the topic, we consult with you, of course, before the presentation. So is there a deadline also for this?
Well, you know, actually, I hadn't thought about that, but let's make a deadline. Let's make the deadline. Let's make it 5 days after our next meeting. So what day is that? So we're meeting next Friday. Let's make it 5 days after next Friday, because that will give you some time to think through these sensorial analytics and what those mean. We'll have a conversation about those, and then you can make a final decision about what you want to do. And you can just email me with your idea. or a couple of ideas. If you're tossing around a couple of ideas, you know, you could say which one would be more interesting.
I have a question about the presentations. To clarify, you said that you want all of the presentations to be just in the last two classes?
I think so. I think we can fit them. If we keep them short, I think we should be able to fit them.
Okay.
I mean, we'll have a little bit less time. We'll have some time to talk about the readings. We'll have a little less time for presentation in terms of like my presentation. But I think we will have time to do the student presentations if we, I mean, I'll look at the schedule, but I think if we keep them to 10 or 15 minutes, we should be able to fit them all in.
Yeah, they'll just have to be group presentations with the amount of people that there are for the text. So.
Okay, all right. Okay, that's something too. That's something I should put into the hopper too. Okay, good. I'll work that out. But do be thinking about your own individual elemental encounter, because I think that will be something that you do on your own, and then the presentations, we can group them together somehow. Thank you for that insight, Paige. That's important. Great. So are there other questions about the syllabus now, or thought I would get back to this. We talked a little bit about, oh God, I'll turn off that closed captioning. We talked a little bit about the sort of academic or scholarly set of conditions that have brought the elemental into the forefront of much of the thinking. The readings that we're doing, we're reading from the key book from Jeffrey Jerome Cohen and Lowell Ducker, this Elemental Eco-Criticism. We read 2 of those essays today. This was a really foundational book for thinking through the elements in the humanities. So we're reading some of that. I would encourage you to read the entire thing. It's an edited volume and there's lots of wonderful essays in there. I kind of went in a direction because I'm a humanistic social scientist. I'm a scholar of the human sciences. I wanted to also really dig into this new book, which just came out a few months ago, which is called Reactivating Elements. So a lot of the reading that we're doing from the class is from this book. And this tends to be more ethnographically grounded rather than grounded in literature and arts. But I think you'll find lots of creative insights there. So we talked a bit about why the elements and why now. And I also wanted to pose to us why ethnography. And I know that many of you are coming to ethnography for the first time. Ethnography has a long and storied history in the discipline of anthropology, but it is our signature method. And it involves all sorts of components like participant observation and interviews of different kinds and archival research and a whole medley of things that come into play to create ethnographic work. More recently, I would say that ethnography has taken on it's gotten a little spin and a little shine from Silicon Valley and allied areas of sort of the world of AI and computational futures, have become very interested in ethnography as a method for understanding how human beings engage with the world in a very close and proximate way. And I think part of the interest there is that ethnography is inherently empirical. And that is the reason why I wanted to, in this class with you, combine these conceptual areas, elements and elemental forms as physical properties, as consequential forces in our world, with ethnography, a form of encounter, a form of methodology that is fully and substantially empirical. That is, it seeks to observe and understand and feel the differences that we experience as human beings, and sometimes more recently as non-human beings. So I think the turn and the twist, the kind of Mobius strip, if you will, of elements in ethnography is really important in that sense. I did want to talk a little bit about the reading that we did from Elemental Eco-Criticism, the longer intro, and go through the principles that they enumerate in this book from 2015, because I think that they really capture much of what that sort of nascent beginning of elemental thinking encapsulated. And they draw attention to these 4 sort of Western philosophical elements, right? Earth, fire, air, and water, that all matter consists of these four elements, the Empedoclean elements, very traditional, sort of recognizable forms. They also really get to this question about elemental matter being inherently creative, which is important, I think, in the context of this class and in context of the work that you are all doing. It's also motile and experimental and impure, because fire, water, air, and earth are never inert. Sorry, there's some typos there. In their ardor for combinatory novelty, the four rhizomata fashion ephemeral things that wander for a while, seeking embrace, a kinetic intermingling at every scale. This kinetic intermingling I find important because it allows for that tactile element, that tactile instance of phenomenological occurrence, the intermingling and the recombination of things in ways that aren't always recognizable, but that are occurring at every scale. The other thing that these authors bring up is that this sort of sorting into four elemental forms, these quotidian substances that we encounter every day of our lives throughout the day. That's a kind of a good understanding of the quotidian. Also function as what they call a rebuke to solely human-centered cosmologies. So there's a way in which the elemental, as a domain of being, as a domain of interaction, also allows us to really think substantively outside of our human experiences and outside of those anthropocentric conceits that are such a part of the scholarly world and that are such a part of the political worlds that we live in. And so I think that that elemental turn really helps us to decenter those human cosmologies. And they do recognize that there's this superseding of science that's occurred, right? The Empedoclean elements have been overtaken by the table of elements, by atomic physics and particle physics and understandings of the natural world that have become more minute and more specific in their qualities. And yet these authors, and I hope we ourselves, continue to be interested in these more traditional forms and to see them in the grander scale that they occur beyond just the table of elements. So these are the kinds of what ifs they propose. What if the elements are more than a threat? And by threat, of course, they're speaking to environmental destruction, but also the continuous threat of storms and other sorts of natural effects that have been occurring throughout the history of humanity and even prior to that history. These elemental forms can be quite dangerous, given where certain people are in the world and the exposure that you might have. They ask about what if, in the face of ruin, the elements extend new invitations. A new invitation to live in the world differently, a new invitation to encounter it differently, a new invitation to imagine something of a future that might be divergent from what we've known. They ask, what if materialities long surpass precipitate new modes of ecological engagement? We can see it in very specific ecological forms. And propose that the four elements assist us in imagining a world that is what they call post-sustainable intra-catastrophic, recognizing that we have these catastrophic moments on Earth. The one we live through now is of our own making, albeit differently in terms of who's responsible for it. And yet these allow for a place of hope. And I think that that place of hope is quite important too, to keep remembering, to keep imagining as well. So these are the propositions, and I would love to hear your thoughts on some of these propositions that they go through. Proposition 1 is that the elements are never easy. I pulled out just some very short quotes from these propositions. I liked this one. Elementary school starts with ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, but any child can tell you that there's nothing easy about rudiments. Does anyone have some thoughts about how there is nothing easy about rudiments, or how elements could be seen as never easy? was a long time ago. I know that, Alberto, were you going to say something? So sometimes, I mean, I think the takeaway here for me anyhow is that sometimes the simplest of things can be the most complex of things. And as we get to know things newly for the first time, as we start to recognize them as unique and consequential, they become both a kind of an epistemological threat, a kind of scary specter on the horizon, and yet something that is so essential to our existence. And for a school child, the 1, 2, 3s and the ABCs are absolutely fundamental to existence. In many ways, the elements are the same for us, except that we've become, in the same way that we have at this point of our lives probably forgotten what it was like to learn the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s, or that they are consequential. They impact our lives at every turn, right? So these kind of rudimentary forms can be quite challenging, and yet I think an invitation to do something differently. So proposition 2 that they provide is that the elements are never still. They say that our elemental houses of knowledge have always been built on unstable ground. And that is certainly an epistemological position of how we cannot always trust the science that has been at our side for the last several hundred years, how we cannot necessarily trust the politics and anthropocentric culture and social systems that we have developed over the last many thousands of years. So the knowledge practices that we have in the world, some of them have worked better than others, some of them have been more functional, some of them have been more dominant, but all of them in this sense have been built on unstable ground. They talk about elements as fundamentals. Again, returning to the easy part, the fundamental part, that they trigger beginnings, they catalyze arrangements, they resist totality, and they open never-ending archives. There are these labyrinthine libraries of the not quite read. I really like that figuration of the not quite read. How do these elemental forms, how do we encounter them, but we can't quite understand them and interpret them? And as we have these elemental encounters, how do we write about them? How do we represent them? How do we actualize them into being? Can be much more challenging, I think, than we might imagine originally. Thoughts on this proposition?
I guess the not quite read makes me think of the Timothy Morton text, like the difficulty with grasping what nothingness is, or like these negative spaces that elements often exist in when we are interacting with them. So
yes, yeah, thank you, Paige. That's great. Yeah, I think the not nothing, right, and the way that Timothy Morton talks about this, and then of course the retreating objects of object-oriented ontology and how those disappear and recede from view, but still exist in their own thingness, right? They're so very much of what they are. And that's a wonderful passage he has on nothingness. That's a nice connection, but not quite read. Proposition number 3, the periodic table has no period. They're clever writers. I like this too, because the periodic table, of course, is the text of chemistry, right? It is the divisible elements of the world and the entire universe put onto a tidy little graph and denoted in atomic weights and their characterological forms. It is another iteration of the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s, this time in the periodic table. But it has no period, they say, meaning it has no end, potentially, and it also is not finite. So they write that the table of elements is an alphabet without a Z, without a Z, a liquid lexicon of spiraled connection. The connectivity is very important because all of these elemental forms of the periodic table interact with one another, influence, impact one another. And yet there's this kind of unending sensibility of of no Z, no N to the alphabet there. I say a taxonomy of atomic weights and shared properties is one possible arrangement imposing some separations where overlaps and entanglements actually flourish. This makes me also think of Sheila Jasanoff's work, and she mentions the periodic table in some of her work in science and technology studies, and probably some of you have read Sheila Jasanoff. I've just got a lot of work out there. I'm sure you've read some of it. She's very interested in the abstraction of science and the scientific method. And she names the periodic table as a very important, very consequential abstraction of science, where you're able to create this very tidy table of exception and articulation between these elemental forms in order to understand them. So she's very interested in the way that science separates, codifies, and categorizes in order for human beings to be able to apprehend what's happening. So it's a model of understanding abstraction. And this question of scientific abstraction matters because it influences the way that we're able to think about our lives, the world, and science itself. The periodic table, climate change is another abstraction that she mentions in this work. You know, how do we sort of apprehend that? How do we understand it? How do we account for it? How do we metricize that which we're experiencing? And then also, how do we convey those stories? So the abstractions that occur in things like the periodic table have an afterlife, and they have a consequence for how we think about and enact the world. And yet there's a way in which those kinds of codifications, those separations can be quite problematic, not allowing us to really think through all of it fully in all its capacity. How about number 4? You are never out of your element. Knowing the world is matter mediated. It's enabled and impressed. It's an intimacy of substance, of force and flesh, trope, plot, and weather. This is a useful method of encounter too, I think, the matter mediation. How we are enabled, how we become impressed with things, what gets impressed upon us as we go about the world. What are the intimacies of substance? What are the intimacies of force coming upon bodies, coming upon urban spaces, coming upon oceans? How does the flesh get inflected there? What are the tropes that we use to describe that? What is the plot to the narrative that tells that story? And whether the weather. It's impossible to think about these elemental forms without imagining weather, in the same way that it's impossible to think about anthropogenic climate change without acknowledging the weather. And yet it is by definition mercurial and fleeting, and in some ways beyond our grasp. We feel it, we know it, we encounter it. It's very difficult to explain. It's very difficult even for scientists to convey to us exactly what the weather will be and how it will shape us in the future. But they write, storm and swelter unmistakable. And that's where the empirical and that's where the tactile really comes to bear, right? You feel the swelter, you know that storm, and there is no mistake that is occurring. Does this ring a bell? Does this piece ring, this proposition ring a bell with anyone? You are never out of your element.
Well, I'd like to say something if possible, but it's
Great.
probably not very tied to this proposition. But I'm very interested here in how there's like a dual character for the element, or the concept of the element, in which elements, or we seek the elements to convey the building blocks for our material reality, and at the same time end up being the building blocks for our virtual collective realities. And they reference to world making. I don't know if it was in this reading or in the introductory one. So yeah, I was interested in this connection. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the idea of the building blocks. And they do have a moment in this introduction where they talk about what your house might be made of, whether it's made of wood or stone, and how that would make a difference. And then if we take seriously that all of our knowledge is built on shaky and unstable ground, that kind of redoubles that question about what kinds of elements we're in, right? What we can trust and what we cannot trust to continue into the future. And, there's been some very interesting work too. I'm thinking of some of the work people have been doing on concrete and cement, because cement, as probably most of you know, is a very, very, very energy intensive material to produce. It takes an incredible amount of energy to create it as a form. And yet it is the most ubiquitous anthropogenic rock on the planet. We've put it everywhere. It emerges out of the ground and squats on the ground everywhere. And so it's taken a lot of energy to create that manstone, and it's also quite ubiquitous. And yet, some of what people have been thinking about is concrete is also something that protects us from the elements, right? It's taken a lot, it's extracted a lot in order to make itself come into being. And yet it also is a protection from the elements. It's a protection from terrible storms, perhaps sea level rise, storm fronts, perhaps, a hotter world, a sunnier place. That concrete has this dual condition of being both a very extracted resource, and also one that we may come to depend on more and more, especially as people become more urbanized. So I think these questions about how these elements of geos get configured through the energies of fire to produce concrete and the stones out of which it's made, but it also creates this human protective condition, is really critical. So I have to agree that we're never out of our element, but I love it as a kind of poetic form too, because being out of your element is being uncomfortable, right? Being out of your comfort zone is to be out of your element in a colloquial way. So I think it's a nice turn of phrase to begin to think about elements in that way. Thanks, Alfredo. That was a nice insight. So proposition 5, you are always exposed to the elements. And they write 60% of the human body is water, 96% of it is made up of 4 chemical elements. That's very few. We're so simple. We're really simple creatures. Oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen, that's it. And yet we believe ourselves to be this apex species, and in so many ways we are, but when you see it broken down this way in the abstraction of science, we become much less complex than we imagine ourselves to be in a philosophical sense, when we really grind it down to the material of our bodies. 60% of the human body is water. So when we're in water, what is water and what is us, and what is the combination of interaction that happens there? That's an interesting question to ponder as you're floating in your bathtub or you're wandering out at sea. The elements are already inside. We're made up, I added this, we're made up of space dust, or the post-Big Bang detritus. The kind of the junk of the universe is what makes up our physical bodies. It's sobering and humbling, I think. Elemental exposure requires narratives of survival and shared vulnerability. And I think that is one of the key elements here, is that exposure is a place of vulnerability. And here I do think of Stacy Alimo. They mentioned Stacy's work in this little passage in the introduction. Her idea of transcorporeality is very, very interesting. I think very applicable, where there's no ending at the skin, right? We are exposed beings, chemicals, radiation, fluids, all kinds of things get into our bodies in different ways. So we are transcorporeal beings that are interacting with the elements, with our environmental conditions at all times, whether we recognize it or not. Tim Morton has, in one of his many books, I'm trying to remember which one, he has a really nice passage where he talks about his own skin's exposure to the sun, right, to the radiation that that hits our skin all the time, and how it has transmuted the cells of his skin, how it's damaged and reconditioned the skin that he wears on his body. And those sorts of elemental encounters, I think, are also quite important. We recognize them when they're pathological, we recognize them when they're a problem, but that transcorporeal encounter is actually always happening, whether we're seeing it or feeling it or not. Proposition 6, elements are steps, not stairs. Or, and then here I'm kind of going back to Tim Morton's piece too, they're a Mobius strip maybe. So believing in elemental or non-human enmeshment requires not just an imaginative leap of faith, but also a desire to take a physical plunge into the stuff of which we are composed, to immerse oneself in a potentially lethal elementarity and to wash away. That's a challenge, to immerse oneself in a lethal elementarity. That's dangerous business, I would say. But the idea of immersion is an inviting one in another sense. I think for elemental encounters, we can imagine these immersions differently and less lethal. What would it be like to have that kind of encounter? The elements have no destination in particular, regardless of our attempts to order them into a goal-driven ascent, to try and create the steps and the stairs. That's why I think that Tim Morton's idea of the Mobius strip is a nice one. It's a good form, or the vortex that they come to at the very end of these propositions. And if something strikes you, please jump in. Proposition 7, the elements make love and war. This is very romantic, I think. This is where the literature comes to bear upon the elements. And they quote Michel Serres in this piece, who can live without or against the 4 elements, without thinking like them, without turning toward them, into them, through them, for them, with them. Michel Serres is a very interesting philosopher. I've used his work quite a lot over the years in thinking through the hot and the cold, particularly this work on ice and melt. But he's also someone who's very interested in thinking about science and technology studies and the difference between the natural sciences and the soft social sciences. So he's fascinated with this idea of the hard and the soft. But I think he has a kind of literary bent as well, as well as someone who thinks really deeply about material philosophy.
Sorry, Cymene?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm very intrigued by the use of the concept of love in this text, because what characterizes this concept of love feel used by Empedocles and the authors. Also love and strife as elements, natural human elements, maybe something between. It's really interesting, this kind of thinking. So
what do you make of that? Do you believe that? Do you agree with that proposition that the elements make love and war?
Yeah, I mean, it's yes, for me it's true, because I think that this kind of imagining of the conflict, the elements it's constantly conflict themselves, and I don't know how to say it, but yes, I believe it. Absolutely. But it's weird, because it's a concept really not scientific like love or strife. So it's, for me, it's like blow my mind, like.
Yeah, I agree, Alberto. I have to admit that I tripped over this one at first, because it sounded a little too poetic. I mean, I love poetics, but it was a little too easy somehow. But then I think, as you say, as we think about it more deeply, of course they do, because love and war all happen here on this earth, and the turmoil and the turbulence and the conflict that you mentioned, those come about in these elemental forms as well. And they also literally make us, right? They kind of compose our world. Where would we be without the element of fire in the sun? There would be no life on earth, right? They literally make us occur as beings, right? As life forms. so that we have love, but we also unfortunately have war. And we use many of these elemental forms to our advantage in different wars, right? I mean, we use the earth for Russian tanks going into Ukraine, and we use the oceans for waging war against Japan in the Second World War. I mean, you know, the list goes on and on and on, unfortunately. And honestly, in making war, there are many ways in which, if you can master the elements to a degree, you can be victorious. So as I think about it in a deeper historical sense, I think it is right. I think they are right that these elements do make love in war. I guess in these troubled times, I want to think about the love part more. Proposition 8, the elements rise and fall. Here they turn to this etymologist. I think it's from medieval times, I'm not sure. Found the term for the universe, mundus, to originate from its ceaseless motion, for no rest is given to its elements. The tumbling of seas and stars, lands and heavens conveys them out of celestial abstraction. Here, I think the tumble is important. Because when we tumble and we crash into things, into one another, when the elements crash into each other as well, there's no way for abstraction. It destroys the conditions or the conceit of abstraction. Again, thinking back to Sheila Jasanoff and the abstractions of science, that encounter, that tactile, that motile ability, that phenomenological sense of touch and tumble completely refuses any abstraction at that level. To live with elements is to live within catastrophe. Living within catastrophe rather than ridding the world of its turbulence means instead to embrace the elemental now. I think they have that italicized now. A poetics of the elements includes stories about how we have always been catastrophic. I think this is an important note for the present too. We have always been catastrophic, that is true. Human communities have always suffered through different kinds of environmental or quote natural catastrophes, all kinds of human created catastrophes, war and plague and famine. But recognizing that catastrophe has always existed perhaps gives us an insight into how we might manage, ride out, encounter the coming catastrophes in a more productive way, in a less painful way, in a less abusive way. We have always been catastrophic. What do you think? Is that true? Anna, what do you think? You're nodding your head.
No, I agree. We've always been catastrophic. I think the idea of stability is an abstraction by technoscience that has fooled us in an illusion of stability. I think that's basically what's been said on all these propositions. It's the basis on these critics of the stability of self and of self, body, and world, because the stability of the division between them.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it works against the idea of stability and simple forms of causality, predictive capacities. That's something that we've seen quite a lot, I think, within the climate crisis, is a desire, a concerted desire, and a lot of funding put towards predictive capacities. And there's a way in which some of these propositions that they have work against that idea of predictive capacity, that we need to recognize that we're on unknown ground, we're in unknown waters, we're in unknown territory in terms of environmental changes that are coming and that are occurring right now. So there's a kind of letting go, a kind of abandon maybe to the idea that we're living and have always lived with catastrophe. And proposition 10, the elements oblige. They obligate us, they enroll us. If we want to think about it in the way that Bruno Latour might describe it, they enroll us into our actancy, into being actors. So once we're invited to think ecologically in their good company, the elements reveal that their narratives are not undemanding. They're not passive actors. Their material poesis requires unremitted labor from them, from us. We cannot be onlookers, but makers and companions in whirl. And for the artists among us, I love this invitation to be makers, not just onlookers, but makers and companions in whirl. And make what you will of whirl. Yes, it does sound a little bit like world, but I think they mean it also too, of course, as the vortex.
I think in the concept of maker philosophy maker of Ian Bogost, the thing about you need to do something and to create new things to know it.
Yeah, completely. And Ian Bogost is a really fantastic thinker in terms of the phenomenology of things, and very much interested in the materiality of things and their weird conjunctions, how they match and don't, and how they come into conflict with each other. He's a very interesting thinker, I think, in that space of ontologies. So this is a real photo of, this is the vortex that was created by the wing of this little plane, and that's colored smoke. Why there was colored smoke, I don't know, but it's an actual photo of the vortex. But I realized that part of the attraction to the vortex as the shape of elements is that so many of the elements take on these vortex forms. We can kind of imagine an earth vortex, maybe a sand vortex is easier for us to picture, a kind of vortex of sand that gets spinning. But when we think of the vortex that's made in water, that's made in air, that's made in fire. If you've ever been near a campfire, so you can see the fire, it kind of spins up into the air, right? As it's fed by oxygen and it's fueled from below, it creates its own fiery vortex. So this, I do have to agree that the kind of the shapeology, the aesthetic form of elements must surely be vortex. Maybe the Mobius strip too, but perhaps we stick with vortex. It's got a nice sort of circulatory quality to it too, I think. So what I thought we might do is take a little break for about, what do you usually do, Paige? Do you do like 5 minutes or 10 minutes, or what's normal?
I think 5 minutes is good.
Okay, good. Let's take a break for 5 minutes, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to tell you a story. So I'll see you in 5 minutes. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So good to see you. So what I wanted to do for the last hour, I know it's our first day together. When we meet up again next week, we'll talk more. I'll turn to you more to talk about the readings and kind of, get into the conversation. But what I thought I would do for this last hour that we're together is give you an overview of a particular case study that I have been working on in Iceland that has to do with cryospheres and has to do with ice as this elemental form. And this is work that I began in 2016 in Iceland, and that has evolved over time. But I'd like to share it with you and also get a sense of your questions and your thoughts about it, because I think it's an imperfect and yet an example of a way in which we can do something that approximates elemental ethnography. So I begin with this image. This is the edge of Solheimsjökull, which is Solheim Glacier in southern Iceland. And this is the edge of the glacier where it is slowly but steadily melting away, drop by drop. And I take this drop, this dripping motion, to be really indicative of so many other processes that we see with anthropogenic climate change, right? It's a kind of a small indicator of what's happening in the wider world as we see glaciers and other cryoforms disappearing. I also approach this work around climatological crisis with certain things in mind. One of those is climate justice and the need for it, and that needs to be a fundamental element of our address of these elemental transformations that we see with ecological crisis. And also that our responses to these interlocking forms of socio-environmental precarity need to be recognized as consequential, right? That these are interlocking forms that can't necessarily be separated from each other. One of the things that you encounter when you work in the space of cryospheres and in thinking through these elemental forms like ice are these scientific reports, like the IPCC report. These come out very often. Some of them are very summative. These are the ones that you hear about in the news media when they have the larger reports, but they also have these sub-reports like this, reports on the ocean, the cryosphere, and a changing climate. It came out, I think this one came out in 2018. And one of the things about reading these reports is that there's rarely good news within them. If you've ever read one, you know what I'm talking about, but trust me, there's rarely good news in these documents in terms of what the science says about our direction in the world. So you find statistics like this from the year 2002 to 2017 that the country of Greenland lost 260 billion tons of ice per year, and Antarctica, a much bigger ice sheet, lost only 140 billion tons of ice in that same period. Part of that has to do with the elemental conditions that are different at the top of the world and the bottom of the world. Antarctica is a very dry place. The Arctic is a very wet place. The glaciers in Iceland and the rest of the Arctic are quite porous and liquidy in their form. In Antarctica, you have very solid forms of ice because of the almost desert-like environment. But of course, the consequence of all that lost ice on land is when it comes into the ocean and becomes sea level rise. And that, of course, is rising much faster than it did in the past, and it's predicted to rise much faster into the future. So these are the kind of diagnostics and statistics that speak to elemental forms. These are the qualifications of science that spell out a certain story about the future of glaciers, about the future of ice in the Arctic and elsewhere, that give us a certain set of capacities and points of contact for thinking about how ice is changing and how this elemental form is being transformed. But of course, the diagnostics of science are about one vector into this space, right? One vector into understanding these elemental changes. As an anthropologist, someone who works primarily with human beings, but not only, I wanted to try and understand some of the dynamics around the loss of ice and the melting world. So I started a research project in Iceland called MELT, the social life of ice at the top of the world. Or sometimes if I was in more of a grim mood, I would call it MELT, the social life of ice at the end of the world, because you could see the Arctic or the Antarctic as the end point of the world, depending on if you think that there is an end to a globe or an end to a sphere at all. That's another question. But in this work, I was really focused on how Icelanders were understanding the changes to their cryosphere, how they were understanding ice that was disappearing off the island that they've inhabited for the last 1,200 years. And a concept that I found really important is an affective concept. And I draw from Anna Singh's definition of this. And that is that precarity is life without the promise of stability. That we cannot, it's that shaky ground, it's that uneven ground that we referred to in these other principles that we were just looking at. This question of precarity is one that seems to condition all of our movements and all of our thoughts in the present. And yet we go on living with it. And so we need to navigate that. We need to negotiate that sensibility. So Anna Singh's thinking about this has been influential in my discipline, but also in my own thinking. In talking with Icelanders about the loss of ice in the country where they live, which is also called Iceland, it's literally Iceland. And I have a friend actually who's an Icelandic comedian, and he often makes this joke and says, you know, Cymene, one day they'll just call us landers. We won't be Icelanders anymore, we'll just be landers. And he's a comedian and he can pull it off. So I appreciate that. The Icelandic sense of humor is quite dry, but also funny and pointed in that way. So this intimacy with ice, how are people living with it and how are people living without it? Especially in a place that's so conditioned by it, in a place that's covered in glaciers. 10% of the country is covered in glaciers and ice sheets. And again, Icelanders have been there for 1,200 years. They've been living in these icy conditions. They've been living next to glaciers for this entire time. And while they are not indigenous people, they also are not settler colonials. No human was displaced when Icelanders came to this northern island at the top of the world. There were no other human beings there when they first arrived. I began to think of this as a kind of living there in these icy landscapes as a kind of cryo-human relation. So how do people and ice occupy the same space and how do they encounter one another? How do they feel about one another? What are the cryo-human politics of the Anthropocene going forward? So this is a woman that I spoke to. Her name's Hulda. She's from a town in the north called Ísafjörður, which means ice fjord. And in Ísafjörður, there are several months out of the winter where the town is not able to connect with the rest of the island. It's closed off because of the snow and ice, and it's sort of impassable by road for several months out of the winter time. And what they also have up in Ísafjörður, it's on the coast. They have a port there, and they often would get icebergs coming into the port. And these icebergs, when she was a child at night, when the icebergs would come into port, they would crash up against each other and rub up these huge blocks of ice on the sea, would rub up against each other and make this excruciating sound. I did a little archival research and found out that this sound actually had a name among the Arctic explorers in the 18th and 19th century. They called it the Devil's Symphony, the sound of ice scraping up against ice and this sort of horrible melody and screech and that it would make as these icy forms would rub up against one another. But for her, even though the sound when she was a little child laying in bed at night and listening to this Devil's Symphony outside her door, she said to me, I do miss it now. I miss the sound of ice on water, knowing that it used to be there and that it's meant to be there, and now it is gone. So there's a loss. There's a kind of a nostalgia, a small nostalgia for what used to be. This is Helgi Björnsson. He's a glaciologist. Iceland's Iceland's most famous, most eminent, most notable glaciologist. He's been at his science for a very long time, for many, many decades. He's retired now, he's probably in his 80s, but he still goes out on the glaciers and does research. He lives out on the glaciers for 2-3 weeks at a time. This is what glaciologists do. It's quite a macho science, I've found. When I spend a lot of time talking to glaciologists about their work and about the science that they develop and how they carry out their methods and how they know what they know and how they learn what they learn. And there is a certain heroism to being able to live out in these icy landscapes for weeks at a time. So Helgi is a very interesting person to talk to because he is the foremost glaciologist in the country and he has a lot of international collaborations. And he's actually, I'll show you this. It's holding up my computer right now, but because it's a really big book. And so it's very good for holding up the computer. Can you see it? The Glaciers of Iceland. Can you see it? There's Helgi's book. So this is the text. This is the text of the Glaciers of Iceland that he's been developing for such a long time. All these accounts of every single cryoform in the whole country. If you talk to a glaciologist about the qualities of a glacier, they will tell you that they have these qualities to them, that they have toes, there are glacial toes, that there are glacial snouts that come out from the corpus of the glacier, that they have tongues. The tongues are very important. The glacial tongues sort of peel out in every direction across the country. And also that they're suffering from something called ablation. Ablation, if you look up that word in the dictionary, you'll find that in the first instance, the first definition is the surgical removal of body tissue. It's a surgical term, ablation. So you can sort of take flesh off the body and you ablate that flesh away. For glaciologists, it's the loss of this cryocorporeal material. So it's the melting of ice or the calving of ice, when ice cracks off of a glacier or an ice sheet and falls to the ground below or falls into the ocean below. So I was very interested to find out that the first person to map the glaciers of Iceland about 150 years ago was actually a surgeon by trade. So I found this use of ablation to be very interesting as a kind of metonym for what is happening now and the kind of the loss of tissue, the loss of form, and how it gets pulled into the scientific vocabulary. The other thing I notice about this scientific vocabulary, of course, is how creatural it is. We have tongues, we have toes, and some of our closest friends have snouts. These are very creatural terms. Like, this is a way of making these glaciers, which are inert bodies, inanimate bodies, making them animate. These are very descriptive terms that talk about living beings, and yet glaciers are not living beings. They're simply frozen water on top of a mountain, in a valley, across a landscape. And yet this kind of language gives them such vitality. This is Guðfinna Alfregisdóttir. She's one of Helgi's younger proteges. She's fantastic. If you were ever out on a glacier, if you were stuck out on a glacier, you would want Guðfinna by your side. She knows what she's doing. Here she's out with a group of students. They go out there every summer to measure the ablation, the loss of ice on top of Sólheimajökull, that glacier I showed you at the beginning with the dripping edge, the melting edge. So they have this very simple form of measurement where they drill a hole into the glacier itself and they drop down this line in order to measure how much ice has been lost during the summer months, and then how much snow and ice gets packed onto the top of the glacier during the winter months. So it's this very simple form of measuring the loss of the glacier, but it's one that she can use to teach students how to do it. And it's also very accessible, easy, and convenient to do. When I asked Guðfinna about the glaciers of Iceland and how she sees the future of the world, she says, this is the largest uncontrolled experiment we've ever done. And she kind of asks with a little twist of irony in her voice, we'll see where it leads us. She's also, Guðfinna has been invited to write for the IPCC reports. So she's one of the glaciologists who actually writes the reports for Iceland and other glaciers in the Arctic region that gets published in the IPCC as the diagnostic science that tells us, it tries to give us that predictive future. So she's someone who's very much invested in her science, but she's also aware of the politics that surround the climate crisis. And I think it's interesting how she talks about this uncontrolled experimentation that we're engaging in. This is a man named Jon. I met him out in the far western part of the country, and I needed to have a translator talk to him and his wife because he speaks only Icelandic and no English. And I have a few words of Icelandic, but not enough to carry on an entire conversation. So we had a translator with us. We were talking to him about the glacier that essentially lives in his backyard. So Jon is a sheep farmer. He's been a sheep farmer his entire life. He and his wife live at the base of Fláajökull, which is near Vatnajökull, which is the largest ice sheet in all of Europe. It takes up a huge expanse of the southern part of Iceland. It's a big white blotch on the map. So he lives near that glacial tongue called Fláajökull. And he's always been very concerned his entire life about the activity of the glacier, worried about how it moves forward and crawls across the land and takes over the land and destroys things. Also very worried about being washed out to sea by a glacial outburst flood. It does happen, and it's happened very, very many times in the history of Iceland, that meltwater will start to collect on top of a glacier, and it creates a sort of a lake on top of the glacier, and there'll be an ice dam that holds that lake in place for a certain amount of time until it doesn't. When that ice dam breaks, you will have a rush of water, a river of water. One case had that river of water rushing down from the top of Vatnajökull all the way out into the North Atlantic at really high speeds, with pieces of ice that were as large as cars, some say as large as houses, that had the fluid capacity of the Nile and the Amazon all combined, except in icy cold water filled with huge blocks of ice. So these jökulhlaups, or glacial outburst floods, have been a serious threat on the island since time immemorial. And people worry about their homes being washed away, their animals being washed away, themselves washed away into the North Atlantic by these glacial outburst floods. But when I was talking to Jon about it, asking him how he felt about the glacier in his backyard, he said he had no love for it. He had very little appreciation for it. Maybe, he said, back in the olden days, it was good because you could harvest ice from it to keep the fish cold after you've caught your fish. But he was concerned about it. Now he says he sees that it's disappearing and it's being lost to climate change. And so he wanted to take a picture near the foot of this glacier for posterity. So that's why I took that photo of him that you saw earlier, where he's kind of pointing into the horizon. Glaciers can be very beautiful, but they also turn and churn a lot of earth up in them as they crawl across the land. So you can see the earth and the soil and the minerals and the rocks that get pulled into these glaciers. And then the meltwater becomes this muddy, this is what I call a glacier beach. But it's not pristine, right? It has a certain combination of elemental forms that get pulled into it. When I spoke to the poet and author Andrés Snær Magnusson, he explained to me that glaciers they were forever. He said, when my grandmother traveled across the glaciers, it was in the context of eternity. It was like the waves, the rocks, the sand, things that would only change over thousands of years. But now many of these same glaciers will vanish in the time between when someone is born and when they become my grandmother's age. So this idea of things eternal becoming things lost, that posterity, that sense of nostalgia, I think is a very important affect that we see in terms of the consequences of climate change and the effects it has. This is a photo of a polar bear that was shot in Iceland in the year 2016. This polar bear came ashore. It had floated over from Greenland. It was on drift ice or on an iceberg. And it came ashore on the coast of Iceland. Polar bears are not indigenous to Iceland, but they do come over from Greenland or from other Arctic sites. And she floated ashore. When they come ashore, polar bears are very hungry. Often they've been swimming. This bear had been swimming for, they calculated 600 kilometers. And starving, right? They haven't been able to eat. They've been swimming and swimming and swimming, or on the drift ice. So when they come ashore, Icelanders consider them to be quite dangerous. You have a hungry bear who's just finally found shore. And so it is national policy in the country to shoot polar bears on sight when they land. And so this farmer had his shotgun and shot the bear, and there was a lot of outcry about the shooting of the bear, especially after they did an autopsy on the bear and found out that it was a female bear, a mother bear who had recently been lactating. So the scientist said that she had been recently with her cubs. The cubs had been with her either in the water or on the drift ice when she came ashore. No one found the cubs, but there was a strong sort of emotional response to this. On the one hand, we could see this mother bear as one of many climate refugees, right? Torn away from where she lives in the world, lost on drift ice, coming ashore in this other country only to be shot on sight. On the other hand, the human-oriented view of the world would say we cannot have dangerous bears coming ashore on the island in remote places where people are vulnerable. There was an outcry from a lot of environmentalists and animal rights activists, both in Iceland and in other parts of Europe, who said she should have been shot with a tranquilizer gun, but the claim was that it would have taken too long to get that to the site. So this mother bear was one of the victims of a changing cryosphere. So when I think about these things, I think about the question of lost ice, the sound of lost ice, the dead bears, the fading sounds, and how forever gets reimagined as ways of encountering the elemental through affect, through understanding how human beings and others encounter these experiences. There's a kind of a nostalgia, there's a requiem for what used to be in all of these encounters. And there's a concern and a worry about the future, how to reimagine that differently. So it seems like everything is not exactly okay. When I was doing this research in Iceland, I was looking for places all over the island to go and speak to people who live near glaciers to find out about their experiences of living with glaciers, of living with ice. And I found a little glacier, and this was its name, Ok. And I was struck by it, of course, because it also looks like the English language acronym, I guess, that means okay, that means everything's fine. It's okay. In this case, it's Ok. Here's a picture of Ok. Ok sits, the Ok Glacier and Ok, there's Ok Mountain and there's Ok Glacier. Ok Glacier sits on top of Ok Mountain. And from the top of Ok Mountain, you can see 5 other glaciers across the horizon. It's spectacularly beautiful. This is an aerial shot that someone took. And you can see this little pool of water at the top. It sits on top of a shield volcano, an extinct shield volcano. And you can see in the middle of the volcanic caldera, you can see the stones kind of rising up over the edge of the mountain. When I went to find out more about Ok Glacier, I came to find this little tiny story. It's about 86 words long, the story, in this English language magazine called Iceland Review. And it said that Ok was no more. Ok Glacier was gone. One of Iceland's smallest yet most famous glaciers, Ok, is about to disappear forever. That was in 2014. And the glaciologist said that Ok no longer qualifies as a glacier. It no longer counts as a glacier because it had become so small and so inconsequential. So I became curious about this little glacier that died, Ok Jökull, Ok Glacier. Jökull means glacier in Icelandic. What was its story? Where had it been? Who had it been? Who had loved it? Who had not cared for it? What was the story behind this little glacier with a funny little name? So I went to the map library and found a librarian there, and I think it was coincidence, or maybe it was just fate, that the name of this librarian was Jökull. His first name was Glacier. And up till that time, I didn't even know that Icelanders named their boy children Jökull, but apparently it's a very, very rare name even in Iceland. But Jökull, or glacier, the map librarian, found all kinds of maps of this glacier throughout time. Here, you see one from the 1780s. It's a hand-painted map that someone has done with a kind of a watercolor, I think. All with the glaciers of Iceland, and here you see it painted. And if you look at these maps over time, over the years, you start to see that the white area that's painted on the map to represent the glacier gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So it's this kind of deep history of mapping the glacier. But I also found that Jökull was on all the human maps. Like there he was appearing again and again in these maps, a small, inconsequential glacier in many ways, but one that warranted a name nonetheless. I found this image of Ok Glacier from 1974. Here you can see at the bottom, you see the top of the crater of Ok Mountain. And there's this weird kind of sinister smiley face coming out of the crater where you see this eye and a kind of, I don't know, a deformed or winking eye and a kind of half smile. That's the crater. And then right above that smiley face, that's Ok Jökull, that's the glacier. So you can see the fern lines spilling out of this. So this was the corpus of Ok Jökull back in 1974. On the left, you see Ok Jökull and the top of Ok Mountain. This is a NASA satellite image. That's from 1986 on the left. And then you see in 2019 on the right. So you see that by the time we get to 2019, the glacier is entirely gone. There's maybe a little tiny bit of remnant ice left in the place where the glacier used to be. And you can still see the crater of the volcano there on this low mountain. I spoke with a linguist named Halldór Hallgrímsson, and he explained to me that Ok Mountain, I was surprised to learn, can actually write its own name. And he had discovered this as he was looking at aerial footage of this little glacier on its mountain. And he said to me, that is pretty special for a mountain, if you think about it. And I had to admit that I had never encountered a mountain that could write its own name. And I was kind of impressed. So how does it work? Well, Hallgrímur is a linguist who specializes in place names. They actually have an institute in Iceland. They're very interested in names and places. And so they have an entire institute devoted to place names. And his specialty was understanding these historic place names. And he told me that in ancient Icelandic, in medieval Icelandic or Old Norse, that Ok would not have been spelled OK like it is now. It would have been spelled OC. So here you can see the top of Ok Mountain, and you see the crater makes a kind of an O. And you also see the rocks inside the crater. When there's snow in the crater, it makes kind of a C. And so Hallgrímur said, here is the mountain spelling its own name in medieval Icelandic, Ok. Or Hallgrímur said, you might say it looks sort of like a copyright symbol. I had to admit that was true too. So what does that mean? It means that Ok is a total original. This is the glaciologist Oddur Sigurdsson, who discovered that Ok Jökull had disappeared and was no longer a glacier. At that time in 2014, Oddur went to the bureau where you get death certificates, and he started to fill out a death certificate for Ok Glacier. He's a glaciologist who's very interested in all of Iceland's glaciers, and he's very interested also in documenting those that have been lost. So he began to fill out this death certificate for a glacier, which for a scientist was a kind of an affective turn, I would say. And then he decided that he thought that was silly, and he put the death certificate away and he shoved it into the drawer of his office and said, I can't do this. It's not, the glacier isn't alive, so it can't really die. And it's ridiculous to think of a glacier as having subjectivity or, giving it a name. It has to have a christening name here, a Christian name, in order to fill out the death certificate properly. So he never did do it. But when I asked him about how he felt about the end of Okyokot, this glacier that he had been watching and admiring and seeing for so many decades, he said it is a loss. It's like losing an old friend. So there was a way in which he felt there was a real loss there. One of the things about glaciers and ice sheets that you probably know is that they are these deep time machines. The glaciologist Richard Alley calls the Antarctic ice sheet the 2-mile time machine. And the reason it's a time machine is because there's so much material and so much history captured in each of those layers of ice. So you have pollen, and you have nuclear fallout, you have dust, and you have pollution. You have everything that happens in the atmosphere, everything that falls upon the ground when that glacier is existing, and then snow becomes piled upon top of it. It's like a layer upon layer upon layer, a stratigraphy of historic records that get captured in the ice. And these are what they call fern lines. You can see the lines sort of spinning out here. They look a lot like tree rings. When you cut a tree, through the middle, it has those tree rings, and those tree rings tell us the age of the tree. The fern lines in many ways can tell us the age of the glacier, because as the snow falls and becomes compacted, it starts to build out in this way, showing its age, and also recording all the history that it has. So in thinking about this loss of this glacier, you could say the death of this glacier, thinking about Odor's death certificate sitting there in his drawer, I began to realize that deaths without mourning, without recognition, when deaths happen and they're not recognized, they're not noted, that's when we start to tip over into the world of extinction. That's the moment when we start to obliterate life without recognizing its loss. So what do we do with that? I decided with my collaborator and working with my Icelandic colleagues, the glaciologist colleagues and friends that I've made in Iceland, to create a memorial for this little glacier. And we began to work on it. It was a process. We wanted to create this memorial that we would leave on the mountain in the site where Okyokot used to be. And we organized kind of a funeral of sorts. This is in August of 2019, when we decided to have this funeral. And here you see people hiking up the mountain. It took us about 3 hours. I'd say with that big group, it took us about 3 hours to get to the top of the mountain. And when we got there, we were able to put a plaque on a stone that we had picked out the year before. We'd found a perfect stone, a kind of perfect placement for this plaque. And some people said some words. Odor pulled out his death certificate from his drawer and brought it up to the top of the mountain and talked about the loss of this little glacier. The poet Andri Snær Magnusson, whose words you saw before, an amazing speaker, he said several words as well. We crowded together because it was cold and windy. Not the worst day on top of a mountain in Iceland, but not the best either. People were shivering and shaking. But we were able to put the plaque in place. We had some kids with us. We had some youth climate activists with their posters, and there's a lot of media that came along because the word about this memorial sort of spread around the world in an uncanny way, in a very surprising way to us. We sort of thought that we would make this memorial and then maybe 10 people would show up. It would be sort of like a kind of performance art piece or some kind of art installation that no one would really care about. Maybe if we were lucky, the Icelandic media might come out and take some photographs. But we were surprised when the plaque itself got into social media and started circulating. There began to be a lot of interest in this question of a funeral for a glacier and a memorial for a glacier, in part because it had never been done before. There had never been a funeral for a glacier that we know of. And so it was new. And so the news was interested in it. The news likes new. They like a story to tell. And so this became a story that they wanted to focus on. On the plaque, and these words were written by Andri Snær Magnusson. He wrote it as a letter to the future. He says, Ok is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. but only you know if we did it. We worked with Andre on the language. We went back and forth a few times, but this is his formulation. I think the letter to the future is really important because it's an address to these future generations. And if you look at the way that he's formed the language, it's also important in a narrative way. Only you know if we did it. It's really speaking directly to the reader. It's really speaking directly to the person who is seeing this plaque. And that personal connection, that personal relationship, I think is striking, and it kind of forces us to imagine ourselves there as the future reader, rather than just a quote unquote innocent bystander. So here's a better day on Elk Mountain, a more sunshiny day. You can see another shield volcano there, a glacier in the background. These are two very famous glaciers that are over there on the horizon. And this is a cairn that's at the top of the crater of Elk Mountain where people place these stones. Very beautiful place. So with this memorial, with this funeral, as I said, the news media got very interested in it. Scientists. This is when I got to be a real scientist, not just a social scientist. Memorialized the first glacier loss to climate change in Iceland. Only you know if we did it, says Memorial. These are just some of the headlines. It became a huge story in August of 2019, second only to Greta Thunberg's crossing of the Atlantic in the solar sailboat. I don't know if you remember that. Way back before, in the times of before the COVID days, we actually had other things that happened in the world, and Greta made that crossing. So this was happening at about the same time. So it's pretty major news around the world, and we were surprised to see how many languages it was showing up in, and the coverage, including being on the front page of CNN with this guy, who, thank God, we don't have to see so much anymore. But maybe the most striking, one of the most striking things that came out of this experience for me anyway, was this tweet that got forwarded. The Economist, which is the British magazine, pretty global circulation, did an obituary for Okkilkut. It was the first obituary for a non-human that they had ever done. And this woman who reads The Economist tweeted this out. She says, as a longtime reader of The Economist, I have often been moved by the obituary column, but I was astonished to find myself weeping over the death of the Okkilkut Glacier in Iceland. A response triggered as much by the beauty of the writing as by the poignancy of the event. Later that day, I called my broker and divested all of my fossil fuel holdings. Someone in Virginia, a woman in Virginia. And I mean, this is just one tweet. This is one person, who says that they did this. I believe that she did. But what is striking to me is the small reverberations, or the sort of undulating effect of some of these practices, right? Creating a memorial, not thinking that will have any impact in the world, but in some ways it does, in some unexpected ways has some sort of response to the larger problem, which is climate change, which is, of course, those fossil fuel holdings, because that is at the root of most of our problems. So that is the story of Okkilkut. And here's some good Icelandic humor for you too. This is a little performance piece on the streets of Reykjavik. I think this was in 2010 or so. This is before I even began my research, but this is a great piece. Someone dressed up like a polar bear. No coins, I need change. A nice encapsulation of Icelandic humor. So thank you. I'd love to hear questions or thoughts about this experiment in cryo-human encounters, in elemental ethnography. Thoughts, responses, reflections? Maybe especially the artists. Alfredo, you look like you want to say something.
I want to say something, but I don't know if I formulated it enough. Yeah, I got caught with this with the world making aspect of the elemental ethnography, and especially now that you reflect on how in this last part of your presentation about the glaciers, I don't know, the concepts of the glaciers dying become social categories and social action, and transform the way people act, what people do, you know. I really like that when we were when we were talking about the notion of, okay, the shape of the elements is a vortex, where I was thinking like relationality of the elements is key as we assemble them, as they construct things. So not only how they relate in the way the elements construct material reality, but they also relate in the ways we use them as elements to construct our own social realities, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I think no, it does. I think it's really nice. It's nice because it's sort of like, how do the elements come to actually shape and push and prod and impress upon our social contexts, our social worlds. And who could imagine a funeral for a glacier? Like, it's a really odd thing. Or as Tim Morton might say, it's weird. He loves the word weird. And the truth is that in earlier times that was unimaginable. And for Icelanders, as I was saying, the glaciers have always been a threat. They were not a beautiful natural form on the horizon. They were not a place where you would ever go willingly. They were volatile beings. They were the place where criminals and outlaws would, hold up and hide out. They were the place that would release these glacial outburst floods. So if anything, glaciers were responsible for killing people. People were not responsible for killing glaciers. And yet, I think we see in this elemental shift the way that kind of imagining it as a death of a glacier allows us to imagine the elements enacting upon us and our social values, our social systems, our habits in ways that we might not imagine. And it does, I can't help, we were reading Latour in my class yesterday, so Latour is in my head right now, but it's that kind of actancy, right? Here's a great example of how ice becomes an actor within this network. And we can critique actor network theory, I have no problem with that, but it's just to kind of think about the agency of inanimate things. Oh, Alberto.
Yes, I have my notes here, sorry. Yes, because this research remind me that here in the extreme south of Chile, my best friend, who is a landscape architect, investigate a town that is very close to a glacier. It's a town that has been there for many, many years. And only recently, there has been a significant increase of globs. I don't know how to say, how is globs is glacial lake arbust fluid.
Same thing. That's exactly it.
Yes.
What they call a jökulhlaup in Icelandic, yes.
And this caused the inhabitants of this village to have to leave a village with which they have an emotional and historical relationship. That make me think, can there be any kind of architecture that can develop to coexist with these events? Is it something that is only concerned to architecture? This is kind of change due to crisis artifact. But now this poetic act of the funeral to the glacier brings me a little closer than the answer that expand my vision of solving the problems generated by climate change. Perhaps there's nothing to solve. There is much to create, like glacier funerals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because since that funeral, there have been several others. There was one that they did in Switzerland just about a month later, and they had been planning it for a year also. But also in Mexico, there's a glacier memorial now that's basically the same words except in Spanish. It looks very much like the one we put up in Iceland. They've put that, it's actually pretty near to Mexico City. And they placed that. There's been a handful of others. And so it's interesting, these rituals that occur. I mean, as an anthropologist we study ritual. It's kind of canonical training is to look at ritual. And one thing we know is that everywhere in the world, throughout the history of humanity, everywhere, there have always been funerary rituals. There have always been rituals for the dead, right? They take very different forms. They have all kinds of different practices throughout time and place, but they have always existed. And so it's this really recognizable ritual form. Every human on earth recognizes a funeral or a memorial, even though it may not be exactly the same one that they would practice in their community, it's recognizable. So it's interesting, your landscape architect friend, what did he say about this? I mean, one of the things they have now is they have very good sensors and monitors for the glacial outburst floods, so that they can tell when that ice dam is about to break and they can tell people to evacuate. But it's not that easy to evacuate 300, 400,000 people from down in a river valley when this thing's about to burst. That's what your friend said also.
Yes, because it's really, you need to act really quickly, and the inhabitants have afraid of this crisis, and now the town is completely empty of the people. Wow. Nobody lives there because the floods are really common. It's like in one day have floods, 2 days not, but the third day again. So
wow. It's quite terrifying, really, because when they happen, they are very dramatic and very destructive. Like, people get killed. It's a scary phenomenon. Anna.
I'm very interested on this debate on the relation between living and non-living, and I think the elements do play an important role in that. I didn't expect you to reach the morning to reach a morning debate, the debate on morning, because that's how I got to this. It was a debate on morning and this relation to extinctions, and that's actually one of the things that interested me a lot on the Haraway and its things work. And also on that, what Alberto was talking about, and on the quote you mentioned on its thing of life without the promise of stability, that's kind of what I mentioned on my comment before. You know, that's what Alberto said. People don't live there anymore because it actually is super common to have the floods, and we usually all know, but we have some way of measuring that will give us enough time to, well, on the plan that works, but when you reach global south, it's not that not that at all. I think we all know that pretty well. So when we are trying to think that, I've been trying to cope with that for many years. And what you're saying on this morning for the glacier, I remember on the morning for a mountain we have happening here on, it is close to Rio. It is in another state, but whatever. That is something that that has been being said by Ailton Krenak, that is one of the major indigenous lideresses here in Brazil. He has a little book that's been launched last year that is like everybody's reading it and such, that is Ideas to Postpone the End of the World. That's a really good book. And in that he does mention that right now they are living in he comes from the Krenak, and I mean, it's a lot of, I'm sorry, I'm used to talking about this in Portuguese, so I have to translate all of that, and it's very specific terms. Sometimes I get stuck. And what he's talking about is there is this mountain there that we call the Vale do Rio Doce. That is also the name of the major company that's mining, the major mining company from Brazil, Vale.
Yeah.
And well, that's the name that we give in this language, but for their language, that is called Watu. And Watu is their grandfather. And some years ago,
nice.
It is their grandfather. And many years ago, it has been legalized for it to be mined. And I guess like 4 or 5 years ago, there has a major accident in which those supposedly controlled mining has actually killed the whole river and everything on its bay. And right now, the whole Krenak community actually can't even get water to drink, and they really rely on the government taking them water. And what he says is that they've been like mourning their grandfather for all this time, but we don't know for how long, and that's what's left for them to live. And so I'm really interested in this relation to how do we deal with that from certain languages and epistemologies we understand as non-living, but it is living for them others, and how we co-inhabit without extinction.
Well, this is part of what's so interesting. Go ahead.
The thing is, just to wrap it up, I think that this living, non-living threshold is very important, and the mourning that we usually don't have, and we don't have the mourning for all that has been being done from the past like 500 years here and things like that. Okay, I'm gonna stop it because I'm just talking.
No, that's great, Anna, and I'm just making a note of it because in our next sessions, I want to talk more about the living, non-living threshold, and I want to talk about rights of nature, and I want to talk about sentient landscapes and kinship. Another anthropological topic, kinship with non-living entities. That'd be great. Thank you. Paige, do you want to give us our outro?
Yeah, I also have one comment really quickly before I close up. The glacial lines really stuck out to me because I think a lot about this with tree lines, and you mentioned how they're kind of the same thing, the way they tell time and the aging of ice and climate events with that. You know, it's not just the years that they tell, it's like actual events of the environment that were happening around them, and how this kind of timekeeper is something you can more easily grasp because you can actually see these layers of change in front of you, opposed to, you know, these scales of time that are so outside of your vision. So it's kind of like perhaps it's a way to more easily think generationally when you can like bring these timescapes into your present view. And that was something I was thinking is really significant about the glacial.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And it's also the thing I love about the tree rings and the fern lines and glaciers is how material they are, right? The trees continue to be material. The glaciers are expiring, but when there is glacial ice there, you can hold it in your hands and you can see it. It's a way of making visible time. And time is a very abstract concept. And we have calendars and we have timelines and we talk about years and dates and all of these things, but it's complete abstraction. But in tree rings and in these fern lines of glaciers, you have time materialized. It's astounding. I mean, it's a kind of almost a magical kind of property of some of these. And then there's also ourselves. Like we have strange records of what we've encountered in our bodies, right? I mean, I'm not advocating that we bisect ourselves in order to see what's in there, but it's that kind of that mixing of what we've experienced too. So yeah, wonderful point.
I mean, I can wrap it up if there's no other, if you don't have any other ending points, or if anyone else has any comments.
Well, I think it was
Yeah, go
like
ahead.
a lot to digest, and I guess I'm just like kind of thinking, and I'm kind of excited of like some of the terms that you mentioned, I think, throughout the presentation, like intimacies or catastrophe, because I feel like in a lot of the current discourse on, I feel it's kind of like a trend topic that we talk about non-human encounters or like ecological stuff, or and I think often it kind of it doesn't mention of like, or it doesn't specify specifically like what kind of humans are we talking about? Are we talking about refugees? Are we talking about us? Are we talking about rich people? Or and I'm kind of like grateful that sort of like it seems like, yeah, like within this course we're going to mention this kind of more problematic sort of encounters, or because it's something that I kind of, yeah, it's kind of always stuck in my head of like, how do I engage with these sort of ecological discourses and not get to like talking these very like conceptual terms. And I mean, I'm thinking all my background notes like the critical race theory that I'm like engaged, and but I think it's very exciting to sort of think kind of these ecological encounters through like problematized experiences of humans, or even like non-humans. Like also a few years ago I did this research also in the port of Rotterdam of like it's called like a, oh my god, like a what, like a disposal facility. It's like where a lot of like toxic waste from the port, like sediments, were like just deposited somewhere because nobody knows what to do with it. And I also found it like super like fascinating, and this was not like a human perspective, it was like a matter. And so I don't know, these are just like a bunch of comments that your presentation kind of brought to my mind, and that sounds exciting.
Great, great. Yeah, I love the material form too, and how that comes to matter. And you made the really important point too about which humans are we speaking of, right? It's that problem with talking about sort of humanity or using the we form. That's why I also think like that you form in the plaque is so interesting that Andre came up with. It's a kind of a direct invocation, because there's so many problems with the we when we're talking about climate change, because there's so much different forms of responsibility for who's at fault or who's guilty. Again, as Tim Martin likes to put it, right? We're all responsible, but some of us are guilty. I think that's real. And there's huge numbers of population all over the world that are not guilty, who interact in this techno-capitalist world in ways that they can, but who are not guilty of causing the large impacts that we're seeing now, not historically and not in the present. So that distinction is super important, I think. And that's where climate justice comes in. And that's why I think that's a really important node to think through. We need to have just transition. That's the kind of terminology now, just transition of energy forms, and climate justice is going to continue to be super important in terms of how we do things going forward. Because if we don't make these changes now, will there be an opportunity in the future? It's hard to say, right? We have actually an opportunity now to do things better than we have. We have an opportunity to do things better than settler, colonial, agro-logistics, phallogocentric capitalism. We can do it differently. We know what doesn't work. So let's imagine ways that we can do it differently. So I think that's the hope piece too. And so keeping that in mind. Good, well, wonderful thoughts, everybody. I think maybe next week when we meet, I'll start out with this wind presentation, and then we can go into the readings. Maybe that's a better way to structure it. And come and talk, and come with questions and thoughts about the reading for next week. We're going to be reading about wind and air. Anything that was in the reading for today, also feel free to bring that back in. That's totally fine. I'm not finicky about that, but we'll have another great discussion. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and so next week you don't want any presentations, right? Just so they'll all be kind of grouped into, okay, perfect, the last two. Okay.
But what I do want to do next week is for you to come with questions and thoughts and points about the reading, about the presentation, so that we can have a good discussion. But like formal presentation, no.
Cool. Okay. For everyone, I'll be sending out the sign-up sheet for the presentation after class then for those last two sessions. And then there's also a Discord where we can chat and discuss anything that has to do with the class. And I can send that invite if people aren't already on the Discord as well.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Paige. Thank you. That's great to get all worked out here.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Happy weekend.
Happy weekend.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can I have the invite for the Discord channel?